Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello, I'm Richard Reinsch, and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. Today, we're talking with Colleen Sheehan about Publius and how he contributes to our knowledge and thinking about American constitutionalism. Colleen Sheehan is a master teacher of the American founding. She's also an excellent scholar of James Madison with two books on his thought. One, James Madison and the Spirit of Republican Self-Government, and The Mind of James Madison. She's the director of graduate studies at the Arizona State School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. We're glad to have her on the program today. Colleen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Richard. Happy to be with Liberty Fund.
Great. So the occasion of the interview is Publius, but you're the co-editor with Jack Rakoff of a new book just out, a collection of essays called the Cambridge Companion to the Federalist, which has, I think, 16 essays from leading scholars on the Federalist Papers and on Publius's thought from a range of great contributors. You, Greg Wiener, Paul Ray, Harvey Mansfield, and others. It's a wonderful volume. As I was reading it, I thought, the first question that comes to mind, and maybe for our listeners, and it's a simple question, but a complicated question, as you kind of flesh out in the introduction. Who exactly was Publius, and why do we need to understand him?
Well, as you know, a lot of folks today probably think we don't need to understand him.
Yeah.
He's just some dead white male, or maybe dead white three males, some trio of dead white males that has, outmoded ideas that have nothing to do with our nation today. And that's, of course, one perspective on the American founding and America's past, that maybe what happened in the past in America should stay in the past, and that we're a new and better nation. That's not my view. I suppose I wouldn't have spent my time since about 16 years old studying these things if it were my view. I discovered the founders actually at a fairly young age, and thought that there was something more than history going on. When I read Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington and Madison, these were people who actually thought that there was something about politics that was ennobling, or that at least it could be. It certainly hadn't always been, but that it could be. And what I think Publius was up to was looking at the history of the world as a history of the struggle of human beings to live in freedom, to not be governed by somebody else for somebody else's purposes. And as Madison, in his notes that he wrote in preparation for the Constitutional Convention, Vices of the Political System of the United States, made very clear, and also in his notes on ancient and modern confederacy, the history of the world showed the history of failure whenever the attempts of a people to govern themselves would occur. Hamilton actually talks about this, right? And in Federalist number 9, he says, if you look at the history of the petty republics of antiquity, talking about Greece and Rome, what you see is just one failure after another.
Yeah.
Hamilton says, well, there might be momentary rays of glory breaking forth through the gloom,
Yeah.
and they might dazzle us with a fleeting brilliance. They leave us with the fact that we failed, that the people that there's never been a successful experiment in free government and self-government. And what Publius was about was to try to, for the first time in the history of the world, find a way, from hell or high water, find a way to set up a system in which the people could govern themselves. So that's a pretty big challenge. And what's really interesting about it, Richard? I mean, Madison, who is the most soft-spoken, shy to the point of just sheer bashfulness, um, not at all a self-promoter like sometimes John Adams, and even Hamilton sometimes were, and just as calm and cool and collected as anyone could be. You can see his excitement in the pages of the Federalist Papers, and later on when he writes the party press essay. He thinks he's figured it out. He thinks he's found a way to actually make this work, and so that we don't have to live by the will of someone else. We can live in such a way that we govern ourselves, which means not just that we do what we want to do, but we govern ourselves under a kind of ordered liberty in which we not only ask others to respect our rights, but we recognize and respect the rights of others.
There's that famous opening in Federalist 1 that I thought we could talk about because I think it sort of encapsulates their project, and that is, we should also talk about who is Publius too, but the Federalist 1, can we found a republic on reflection and choice versus was accident and force? Those two different contrasts. What would it mean to Publius to forego founding or instituting this new constitution on reflection and choice, or failing to do so?
Well, I mean, I think it means everything. We either do it on the basis of reflection and choice, or we don't do it at all. When Hamilton says that in Federalist 1, that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government on the basis of reflection and choice, or whether they're forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. It's almost the opening salvo of the Federalist Papers. What that is really the answer to what Publius says in Federalist 39, that only a republican form of government would be acceptable to the genius of the American people, to the principles of the American Revolution. Because, of course, the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence declares that all just governments, all legitimate governments are based on the consent of the government. And all governments not based on the consent of the government are not legitimate, not truly popular, not truly republican government. And so it has to be on the basis of reflection and choice. You've got to try it, and you've got to get it right, or you've really not succeeded in anything that the American founding is about. So, when they're writing Federalist, when Hamilton's writing Federalist Number 1, he doesn't know if it's going to succeed, right? This is the first Federalist paper, and there are going to be many afterwards, 85, of course, in total, written to the people of the state of New York, a state in which it was not at all clear that the Federalists would beat the Anti-Federalists. And if they didn't win in New York, it was likely that the Constitution would fail. We would not have a new Constitution. There might not, in a few more years, be anything called America. So it meant everything, Richard.
The reflection and choice, but one never gets a pure choice. What events have sort of forced them into this move? First, the Philadelphia Convention, and then this sort of attempt to have a theoretical exposition of the document that's come out of that convention. But they did change. They are proposing a change, a complete change to the Articles of Confederation. With some, we can go back and forth about the legality of what they're doing, but they do believe it's called for by circumstances. And some seem, the Anti-Federalists, as they coined them, unwilling to go along with that. Maybe just talk a bit about is the claim that the accident and force would come about if they're not listened to, and the Anti-Federalists are sort of allowing this experiment to be open to accident and force?
Wow, what a great question. Yeah, it would be a kind of drifting. Except that I think and so we wouldn't deliberately form a new government. We would probably, I mean, the economic situation was so bad. Inflation was so high. You know, the phrase "not worth a continental" was pretty popular in those days. Widows and orphans of the soldiers from war didn't have enough money to live. We all know about Shays' Rebellion, and they prevented the courts from sitting so that they couldn't foreclose on the farmers' mortgages. And then they'd be sent to debtor's prison, and then their families would probably not make it. And so, I mean, the situation was dire. And some of the Anti-Federalists tried to downplay it, but everyone knew that major changes were absolutely necessary. When Madison says later on in the Federalist Papers, really addressing the question that you just posed, and one that the Anti-Federalists brought up quite a lot, that, you know, the convention was not authorized to make these kind of changes. This kind of an entirely different new constitution on a new basis, remember, because it's not on the basis of state sovereignty anymore. It's on the basis of popular sovereignty. And so it would be like the UN reorganizing itself so that it would be the sovereign nation of the world. That's a pretty big change. And the Anti-Federalists try to downplay how bad the situation is, but they know it's bad. And so Madison says later on in the Federalist Papers that, you know, this is a question of necessity. Forms just have to give way when it's an issue of necessity in politics.
And they're also, by calling for state ratifying conventions, there is the element of popular sovereignty here. I mean, they are... You could criticize them on the rule of law, but it's a question they're willing to pose to the people's representatives. Right.
And so the Constitution's nothing but a dead letter until life is breathed into it by the ratification of the people of the several states of America. So all it is a proposal coming out of the Philadelphia Convention.
Yeah.
On September 17th, 1787. It's a pretty important proposal, and it's got the weight of people like George Washington behind it, which means everything. But nonetheless, it doesn't carry any force of law. It's simply a proposal. And it has to be ratified by 9 of the states until it can go into effect. And of course, when it's ratified by 9 of the states, it's only in effect in the states that ratify it.
Yeah.
Because the authority comes from the people of several states.
Now, you mentioned the New York Ratification Convention and the motive for the Federalist Papers, an immediate motive to influence their deliberations. That's sort of a question, and sort of it's one that I asked at the beginning. Publius is Alexander Hamilton. It's James Madison, and to a lesser extent, John Jay. How do they come together to do this and to sound, although we can find differences in their arguments throughout the papers, people have pointed out contradictions to me, but at the same time, they sound remarkably similar and on point. And these are 3 people, different experiences, different ideas, and they come together to do this. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, it's the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton, which makes a lot of sense, of course. He's from New York. Not originally, of course. He's from a little tiny island, only 30-something square miles in the Caribbean, called Nevis, which is down by St. Kitts, but moves to the United States when he's a teenager. And actually at some points in his life, says, "What? Am I the only American here?" When people are thinking of themselves as Virginians or New Yorkers or, I guess, Delawareans, is that a term? You know, Hamilton always thought nationally. Yet he lives in New York. Of course, he intermarries with the famous Schuyler family of New York. We all know that now because of the play and the Schuyler sisters. Very prominent family from around. There's actually a place down by Albany called Schuylerville. And where I am right now in upstate New York on Lake Champlain, I look out my window and I see an island called Schuyler Island. A great fishing over there, I hear from the folks around here who like to fish. Anyway, so Hamilton had been at the convention with two other delegates from New York. And the other two delegates, John Lansing and Robert Yates, were very good friends of then Governor of New York, George Clinton. And these guys were big fish in the pond of the state of New York. And they did not want any major changes to the Articles of Confederation. They wanted New York to keep the power that New York had. And New York was successful. New York had New York City. New York had financial successes that were happening in the United States to the extent that there were much of that kind of thing going on. But, they could strong arm states like New Jersey and some of the smaller states. And they didn't want to lose that power. So at the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton was always outvoted by Lansing and Yates. And when they go back home after the Constitution,
and you voted by your state. You got one vote per state.
That's right. And so New York went with Lansing and Yates until actually Hamilton left, and then they left, and so New York wasn't even there for a while. But Hamilton returns at the end to sign the Constitution. So he starts the effort in New York to advocate for ratification of the Constitution with Lansing, Yates, George Clinton, and a group of very powerful people who became part of the Anti-Federalist cause on the other side. So he tries to enlist a number of people to help him, but he's not successful with, some of the folks he asked. So he ends up, besides Jay, and originally Jay was supposed to do a lot more of the writing than he did. He became ill and ends up only writing 5 of the 85 papers. But ultimately, Hamilton asked a Virginian, James Madison, who agrees to do it. Now, interestingly enough, Richard, just about a week before the publication of the first Federalist paper in October 1787, I went back and looked at this. John Jay's wife, Jay was from New York, down in Westchester County. Sarah Jay kept very nice notes about all of her dinner parties. And there was a dinner party about a week before the first Federalist paper came out. And interestingly enough, it was all men, which is very unusual this is not polite company, wouldn't be considered polite company. But Hamilton, Jay, and Madison are all at that dinner.
Yeah.
Now, there are others there, and of course, it's a secret that who Publius will be, and they don't. This is not to be something told to others. So presumably, they don't talk about this at dinner, but they must have huddled in a corner at some point. How could they not have?
Yeah.
With their plans for this coming out. So wouldn't you have liked to be a fly on the wall at that dinner party?
Yeah. No, well, you think about co-authored pieces, how those sometimes get worked out rather quickly.
In the beginning, they tried to communicate, as much as they could, sending sometimes essays to each other and trying to get things done in advance. But as we all know, who've been students, and especially those who've been graduate students, that ends pretty quickly, and you tend to be things get ahead of you, and you're writing late at night to meet the deadline the next day, and that's exactly what happened to them. And so the actual original plan that Hamilton lays out in Federalist Number 1 isn't precisely followed at all as time goes on. Jay is unable to write some of the essays that he was originally slated to write, and just the pace that they were following to get these essays done and to print. It's amazing that the work is as coherent, actually,
yes,
as it is, given the difficulty there. And the question of speaking with one voice, of course, this is one of the questions that Jack Rakoff and I asked in this volume. Let me say one note about Jack. Jack is an historian, and Jack is
Jack Rakoff, your co-editor.
Jack Rakoff, from Stanford. He's a Madison scholar, a founding scholar. He is a smart, witty. What a pleasure to work with him on this volume. It was a constant going back and not just about getting things done, but talking about the ideas. And really, in our correspondence, I think the founding for us during that period of time was very much alive. And so, but Jack and I have different views on a number of things. And one of them is whether we should call the author of the Federalist Publius, or whether we shouldn't do that because it's really three separate people, and we should always talk about them in terms of Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. Now, I'm fine with it both ways. I like country and Western.
Yeah.
But Jack, as an historian, really didn't like the idea of referencing them as Publius. And I said, well, let's not standardize this throughout the text. Let's let folks, do how they want to approach it. And Jack agrees with that. And so that the volume reflects both. Those who want to take the Federalist author at his word. I mean, every essayist signed Publius. They deliberately chose to speak in one voice, even though they didn't agree on everything themselves. They certainly did not agree on everything themselves. And there are things that, when Madison has to write about the Senate, it's difficult for him. He and James Wilson almost wanted to go home on July 16th because they were so incredibly upset about the Great Compromise.
Yeah.
They thought it was an anti-Republican compromise. Madison could not have been more disappointed in that. Yet he's the one that writes about the Senate and has to try to defend that it's based on equality of the states.
Some have said, and this I think leads to a broad question, the Federalist Papers, really what you need to read are the convention notes, and there are various versions of those. But that's really where you learn about the Constitution and the state ratification debate notes, which we now have, I think like a 14-volume edition out on each state's ratification debates, including press coverage of the debates, contemporary press coverage. And the Federalist Papers is something else. It's been overemphasized. But I think that leads to a question, which is, what does Publius add, contribute to our thinking about the Constitution that wasn't there before?
Well, it's the most comprehensive of all the writings, of course, during the ratification era by Federalists or Anti-Federalists. As you know, Richard, because it's published by Liberty Fund, Gary McDowell and I put together a book called Friends of the Constitution, Writings of the Other Federalists, 1787, 1788. There's a whole slew of people who wrote to advocate ratification of the Constitution. And there's some very, very fine writing. Foreign Spectator, it's just fabulous material. I think Fabius, that those essays are excellent, and James Wilson, and a number of others, but no one comes even close on the Federalist or Anti-Federalist side to such a comprehensive examination of the principles and processes of the Constitution. So what the Federalist Papers adds, as people like Justice Story, and still today the Supreme Court will, not at all unusual to see the Federalist Papers cited in court opinions. It's a in-depth, rich interpretation of not just the provisions of the Constitution, but the meaning and purpose of the Constitution. Now, that is not to say that it's pure philosophy. It's not. It's political philosophy. It's very political. It has a political purpose. It's for a particular cause. But as Publius says in one of the Federalist Papers, one of the reasons I think that they wrote anonymously. Somebody asked me this just the other day. Why did they write anonymously? Were they trying to hide something? Or, well, first of all, of course, it's very typical in the 18th century for people to use pen names. But I think the other reason is that they don't want to be identified as near partisan advocates for this and for people to make a judgment just based on whether they like Madison or they like Hamilton or they don't like them. This kind of idea that factions are often caused by attachment to leaders. You're pro-Trump or you're anti-Trump. If Trump is for it, you're against it, and things like that. Mm-hmm. They were avoiding that. Madison says in one of the Federalist Papers, think not about from whom the advice comes, but whether the advice be good. Mm. And so they really did set a very high standard for political discourse, even though it's political discourse about a particular cause at a particular moment in history. Jefferson called the Federalist Papers the best commentary on the principles of government that was ever written. Pretty high praise.
Yeah. Thinking about and I wanted to talk about this essay because to the extent people have read Federalist Papers, they've encountered it maybe in a survey course, and it's one of the central papers. Although I've been taken by, and you have one essay in particular on this in your edited volume on the degree to which the Federalist Papers is about national security and having a strong union in order to protect the country. And I've tended to always go past that and go straight to the thinking about constitutional liberty and republicanism in the later essays. But the Federalist 10, famous essay, Madison finds a novel idea, perhaps extent of the republic will help prevent against the vices of minority or majority faction through the instrumentalities of the government. Was he wrong about that ultimately? Has he been proven wrong just through sheer size of government and the ease with which special interests can, in fact, work against the greater good?
This is actually a question that I've been trying to myself give some good thought to lately. His idea is, as you know well, Richard, is that he sort of turns the small Republican argument on its head. It had always thought that you can't have popular government by the people, except in a small territory, because if it gets large nations, and especially empires, are despotic. I mean, look at China, look at Persia, look at what happens to Rome when Rome expands. And so that's there's hardly, no one disagrees with that until Madison says, well, but wait. Yeah. One of the things that a large republic can do is control the violence of faction. But the only way Madison thinks we can do that is if this large republic is also a federal republic. There has to be small republics within the large republic, so that the tools of self-government are still viable. And so federalism is not just a mere compromise for Madison. Federalism is absolutely critical to republicanism. That's my read of Madison on this. But this whole idea of space, what space does is create time for deliberation. And Greg Wiener is the master of this. His book, Madison's Metronome, is all about this idea of time and how time slows things down. And it's like what they used to say in the 18th century, save your breath for it,
Yeah.
Today we say count to 10, before you respond. That cooler heads will prevail, that reason can prevail over passion if we can just slow things down. Now, I actually think it's more than just time that's at work here, that space creates more than time. That what Madison had in mind was that something's happening. I actually, in the article I wrote for this, quoted to Jack Rakoff's chagrin, I quoted Buffalo Springfield. That something's happening here.
Yeah. Yes.
There's something happening in this time of this slowing down, and the processes in place that Madison envisions in place have to do with the refinement and enlargement of public opinion during this time, and that there's all of these mechanisms as well as extra constitutional factors at work a representation, newspapers, the growth of newspapers throughout the country. It has to do with this idea of communication, and that communication is how we refine and sharpen, hone, moderate our selfish and narrow opinions. Basically, it's a form of civic education, right? I mean, this is what civic education is all about: is elevating the public view. Now, what does that mean today? I mean, I think that this made a whole lot of sense in the 18th century. I still think theoretically it makes very good sense. The problem with our day, is that there are things that are equivalent to the contraction of the territory. You know, when folks say today the world is a smaller place, it's not that the globe has shrunk. Mm-hmm. It's that communication is such that ideas, opinions, even passionate ideas and prejudices can spread rapidly and quickly. And so the conflagration of faction is once again a problem, especially because of the internet, in a way that, of course, it wasn't in the 18th century. So even though we're even a larger country now, in some ways we're smaller. And this makes the possibility of rule by faction once again a problem in America in a way that hadn't been quite so much. I mean, it's always a problem, Richard. I mean, the solution in Federalist 10 is not a panacea, because in the final analysis, if a majority is determined to be factious, they will, in the end, the majority makes the law in the end. There's no substitute for a Republican people being dedicated to Republican principles.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I'm listening to you talk about the world shrinking, and that brings to mind that technology enables people to demand more from the government, or to increase, their inputs, and to be dissatisfied even with a Congress being able to handle them and wanting immediate redress for things. But that, to me, suggests there's another problem here, and it's a problem that Wilmore Kendall wrote about, evaluating the Federalist Papers, which is how do the people remain virtuous? And he had a great essay, The Missing Federalist Paper, where he tries to say, argue essentially there's a paper missing here on the nature of the virtuous Republican people and how they deliberate, that there was perhaps too much presupposition in the Federalist Papers about Republican liberty in that regard, that there's not the engagement with virtue there that needs to happen. What do you think of that?
Well, that, of course, has been one of the questions that's been predominant among scholars of the American founding for many years. And the dominant thesis about the founding is that they dispense with the need for virtue in the citizenry, and instead they created what might be called a modern commercial republic. This was Martin Diamond's thesis, Tom Pangle's, lots of folks, that you could have a nation of devils and you could still end up with the public good because of the kind of like force counterforce, this sort of Newtonian politics. One vice counteracts another vice, and somehow in the end you get a common denominator, a low common denominator. There's nothing elevated about it. So Martin Diamond called it low but solid.
Low but solid.
It's mediocre. America celebrates mediocrity. I just don't see that at all. I think that's missing the forest for the trees in the Federalist Papers. I mean, Publius is not preaching about virtue.
No.
Processes don't create virtue. Madison says in Federalist 14 that what we're doing is forging not just a new course, but a new and more noble course. And in Federalist 39, he talks about the spirit and the genius of the American people. And then, of course, he talks about later on in Federalist 55, is there no virtue among us? Well, if there's not, no amount of checks can do anything to make this experiment work. So, I mean, it really is an experiment in self-government. The Federalist Papers, it's not an etiquette book. It's a political etiquette book about how we ought to conduct ourselves and our manners. But it's all about the idea of what it means to be a free people, the processes that have to be in place to be a free people. And it's also, of course, not the government's job to make us good or to make us happy. That's our job.
Yeah.
The government's job, when Madison says in Federalist 10 that the first object of government, a lot of people mix this up and they think he said the first object of government is protection of property. Not at all what he said. He says it's the protection of the faculties of man from which the rights of property originate. So it's a protection of our exercise of freedom, the freedom of the mind. And it's on that basis that we make choices, hopefully based on reflection and choice, that then create a free country and a free people. It's not the job of the Constitution to tell us how to live our lives. It's not the job of the Constitution to tell us how to live our lives. It's our job to make a Constitution so that we can live our lives well.
So with Publius, obviously, we have these institutional mechanisms, maybe mechanisms isn't the right word, but processes and procedures to both give government energy that it needs to govern and also to restrain it, channel it, filter its power. There's famous discussion in Federalist 63, the idea of auxiliary precautions are needed to protect constitutional liberty and the overall workings of the system, separation of powers, checks and balances, the executive veto. He doesn't mention judicial review, I don't think, although that comes in later. There's a later discussion of the judiciary. Are these auxiliary precautions still working? There's a lot of smart people now talking about how this is just a misguided thing. And the discussion was going on for a while that, well, of course, people put their partisanship now above, say, defending the interest of the institution that they're in. It's far more important if you're, in the party in Congress that you go along with your president rather than, say, defend precedents that outline separation of powers. Was this sort of another misguided notion, or is there something deeper going on?
The idea of auxiliary precautions and checks and balances and things like that, are these things still viable today?
They outmoded, by partisanship, yeah.
Yeah, great question. Let me back up there just a little bit. In Federalist 51, paper devoted to these inventions of prudence, auxiliary precautions that Madison talks about. If men were angels, no government would be necessary, and so forth. When he talks about these auxiliary precautions, by which he means essentially kind of four things in particular: separation of powers, checks and balances. Within separation of powers, also bicameralism, that separation within the legislative branch, and then finally the vertical kind of separation between states and nations in the form of federalism. And so he talks about the necessity of these auxiliary precautions, these inventions of prudence. But he also says, which is often forgotten in this essay, but a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on government. So, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. Still, the primary dependence is on the people. In other words, on the people, their character, what they believe in, what they cherish, their morals, their mores. And so that for Publius is always number one. There can't, as Bill Allen has said so well, there can't be a republic without Republican citizens. Yes. And so that's the forest that's often missed for the trees by some folks, I think, reading the Federalist Papers. Of course, separation of powers, checks and balances, none of these things are mentioned in the Constitution. They're woven in the processes, the way it's set up, but the words aren't there. Are these things outmoded today? Well, the progressives think so, right? This starts with Woodrow Wilson, who really didn't like Madison's ideas at all. These two Princetonians couldn't be further apart in their views on government. And Wilson thought it just got in the way of good administrators getting things done. And if Wilson had his way, he basically had public opinion. He thought most people were pretty stupid and that they should be quiet. That's not Madison's view. That is not, Madison is absolutely, he really was a man of the people in the sense of promoting a reasonable public opinion and trying to find the processes to do that. I think those things are still, as separation of powers, checks and balances, bicameralism, still as important and viable today, as necessary, if not more necessary today than they've ever been. Look, why does a lot of these ideas come out of Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws? Why is Montesquieu so concerned with these mechanisms and processes of government? Very simply, the prevention of tyranny.
Yeah.
Liberty is not safe when all power is concentrated in the same hands or set of hands. And so this is just a truism in politics, that these kinds of institutional arrangements are absolutely critical to the workings of free government.
A question how would, though, Publius respond to the creation of our modern administrative state? How would he respond to, you see in the conservative legal side, there's constant talk of the non-delegation, a doctrine that this is automatically unconstitutional. Progressive scholars would say, no, there was actually delegation near the founding. But apart from all of that, just the administrative state holding these three powers in its hands seems to me, as I read the Federalist Papers, the definition of tyranny. And there are a lot of smart people writing about how to curtail this. A lot of smart people writing about reinvigorating Congress with its powers, and nothing really seems to happen. Yeah,
I think for Madison and Hamilton and Jay, Hamilton might not be quite as vehemently opposed as Madison, but even he would be opposed because these guys are not elected, and they are running the country. Congress John Marini has done such a great job on this subject. Congress has abdicated its responsibility to rule. They are supposed to be making the law, which is the most important function of government. None of the others can do anything until there's some kind of law to be enforced and interpreted. Yet they're not doing it. They're allowing these bureaucrats, these nameless, faceless, unelected people to basically take the place of the people's representatives. But remember, when these bureaucrats take the place of the people's representatives, they're taking the place of the people. Mm-hmm. It's a destruction. It's the destruction of any possibility of self-government. And it is what is tyranny except to the rule of masters over those who must obey. And that's what the administrative state in America has. When Weber talked about the bureaucracy being a kind of an iron cage, and Ralph Lerner wrote a piece once where he talked about shaking the iron cage. And don't you feel that way sometimes? Who doesn't in America today? With the government is just one aspect of this. This mentality has seeped through our country, and it's in universities. Everything has become the DMV, where nothing is possible to get done without lines that are enormously long, with people standing behind the counter who don't even ask, can they help you, half the time, because they're talking to someone else. This whole business of people ruling your life, and it's inefficient and it's tyrannical, and it's meant to make us be some kind of unthinking, mindless, not citizens, just kind of creatures who wait to take the next order from the paternal state. Sorry, I get excited about this.
No.
I find it stifling, enervating. I think it's one of the worst things, and it grows more and more. Universities, and especially state universities, are just absolutely. How can Amazon get you toothpaste within 18 hours, but we can't, get a check paid to somebody that we have come to speak and give a lecture? That takes 2 to 3 months.
Yeah.
Why is it so impossible to get these things done?
No, I've asked myself the same question in any number of institutions that I deal with, and even as we think about the lackluster response over basic medical goods and devices in response to the COVID crisis, that somehow it became impossible to find an N95 mask. That was because of the administrative state. Most people didn't realize that, and the licensing procedures of the Food and Drug Administration made that nearly impossible at first. And then, of course, you were behind the ball when you needed to generate them. I'll end with a question that I think about, and I think Publius sheds light on maybe how we should think about it. It seems like factually it's nearly impossible to deliberate about serious questions anymore, not only in Congress but in public. What would Publius make of that? And just given your discussion about time and delay, and in this idea of in the Federalist Papers, the cool and deliberate sense of the community. I mean, this is sort of republicanism working well, but it doesn't work well, this part now for us.
Before I answer that, I want to give one example of, this whole mentality that goes along with the administrative state of things that can't be done. It can't be done. It would take, imagine before the coronavirus. I was just talking with some friends, Zooming with them yesterday about this. And had anybody said at a university, we all have to go online within the next week, they would have said it's impossible. It'll take us 7 years to figure that out. Absolutely impossible. But every university within a matter of days managed it. We all just jumped in and did it. I learned Zoom. Everybody, if I can learn Zoom, anybody can learn Zoom.
Yeah.
I'm not very techy. And people just did it because necessity is the mother of invention, right? It's amazing what people can do if they give it a shot. These things are not so impossible and do not need so many committees and so much discussion all the time. So that's one thing. Why don't we deal with serious questions anymore in America? Well, I think it's Harvey Mansfield's article, chapter in this book, is about that. And certainly in terms of the academy and the social sciences, political science in particular, political science deliberately refuses to deal with the important and serious questions because it says we can't deal with any of the questions that have to do with values, which of course are all the important and interesting questions in politics.
Uh-huh.
And so political sciences has just decided to be a kind of a boring, meaningless discipline. And it's no wonder that people who actually are in politics don't read anything that political scientists write. I mean, it has no relevance to political life. I don't think in the society, though, Richard, that we have dispensed with the serious questions. I think they're out there, and I think many citizens are talking about them.
Yeah.
And that's why there's so much controversy in the country right now, because there's a disagreement about health care, about abortion, about marriage. The list goes on and on. These are all questions about justice and how we should live our life, what it means to be human, and what is the role of government vis-a-vis the individual. And these kinds of decisions that we have to make as individuals and or as a society. Politics won't go away. These questions are there. They're important. And I think ordinary citizens are dealing with them. It's true that Congress tries to run away from a lot of these questions, but we have a presidential election. I mean, it's hidden behind the veil of COVID-19 right now, but I think the American people are demanding that those who would be the leader of the United States take up these questions, take a stand on them, and say why they believe one way or another.
Yeah.
Joe Biden has recently taking a very different position on the Hyde Amendment than he held previously. And there's some people who celebrate that and some people who don't. But either way, he'll be, his feet are held to the fire on those kinds of questions, just like Trump's feet have been and will continue to be held to the fire on what he says and he believes in and what the future direction of the United States is. I think the biggest question for all of us is, are we one people?
Right.
Are we any longer one people? What does it mean to be an American? If Tocqueville came here today, Richard, and went around America and observed in that brilliant way that he did back in the 19th century, who would he meet? Who would these people called Americans? What would they be like? What would he think of them? Would Tocqueville see today in America more than America?
Yeah.
Or would he not do that?
I suppose it's also where he would visit. Colleen Sheehan, thank you so much for your time today. We've been talking about Publius, America's Republican genius. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard. It was my pleasure.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.